We're outside today with there's my dog. Anyway, we're outside. We're going to read the chapter on secularism, which I believe is chapter 4, and I am going to swing. So if watching this makes you sick, don't watch it, just listen to it. Here we go. And you'll probably have a really bad spot, but is what it is. Secularism, the battle of ideas and the battle of stories. If you want to beat a sports opponent, study his playing style, develop a strategy, and compete with all your heart. When the clock runs out, you'll know whether it was enough. But what if the competition is not in sports, but in the world of ideas? Judging by the way advocates of secularism promote their worldview, the answer is to defeat your opponent by turning his audience against him. Tell a story in which your opponent is the bad guy, so people will discount him from the start. Stories have tremendous power, for good or for ill. True stories helped William Wilberforce turn the British public against slavery, saving thousands of lives and setting millions free. False stories helped Nazi Germany and communist leaders in Russia slaughter tens of millions of people and enslave hundreds of millions more. The greatest worldview conflicts in Western civilization today result from the collision of stories. The story of Western civilization taught, until fairly recently, was this: the best aspects of the West resulted from its grounding in the Christian worldview, particularly the Christian understanding of morality, human value, and economic freedom. Secularism challenges this narrative and tells another story, claiming credit for the best aspects of the Western world, while laying the blame for the worst aspects at Christianity's feet. To understand secularism as a worldview, we'll look at the secularist narrative, as well as the rise of secularism as a pattern of ideas, beliefs, convictions, behaviors, and habits, and then dig into what secularists believe and try to persuade others to believe about the world. Section 2. The term propaganda refers to mass suggestion or influence through the manipulation of symbols and the psychology of the individual, with the ultimate goal of having the recipient of the appeal come to voluntarily accept this position as if it were his or her own. Propaganda campaigns typically portray opponents as possessing evil character qualities and motives in order to incite feelings of indignation and revulsion toward them, such that any harm directed their way is viewed as an act of just retribution. I can say that word. Many worldview battles in our day are examples of propaganda in which the most extreme language possible is used to caricature those on the other side. For example, in 2011, when a majority of North Carolinians voted for a constitutional amendment establishing marriage between a man and a woman as the only valid or recognized legal domestic union in the state, the diatribes rapidly multiplied. North Carolina, keeping hate alive, really brings out the human garbage side of our species. NC's electorate is dumb as trash. Even mainstream media outlets ran with this theme. One op-ed piece in the Los Angeles Times featured this headline: Obama, gay marriage, and a win for bigotry in North Carolina. This kind of rhetoric entirely ignores the arguments about whether gay marriage is a good idea or not. It seeks instead to portray opponents as hateful, bigoted, dumb human garbage. This is propaganda. It's a rewriting of history to turn public opinion against traditional marriage advocates without making or employing watered-down versions of actual arguments. It's no secret that Americans disagree with one another about many things. These disagreements occasionally lead to sharp words, but the issue below the surface, the one almost no one talks about, is the way history is rewritten to justify a particular worldview, and not just on a single issue like gay marriage. For instance, you've probably heard the following narrative, and it is exaggerated to make a point. The followers of Jesus were evil liars whose goal was to establish a macho, misogynistic cult. The good people of Rome tried to stop them, but the wicked Emperor Constantine managed to establish Christianity as Rome's official religion anyway. Once in power, Christians intentionally undermined Rome's strength until this once great civilization collapsed. The church blindly pressed forward in its obsession with control, plunging Europe into the Dark Ages. It took a few hundred years, but Europe was eventually rescued by scientists and philosophers who bravely risked their lives to challenge the church's teaching that the earth was flat in the center of the universe. Occasionally, Christians gained power long enough to burn tens of thousands of witches, massacre millions of natives, and launch cruel crusades against innocent, civilized Muslims. Fortunately, due to the brilliance of those who rejected the church's teachings, the Enlightenment saw the triumph of science and reason over religion. However, we must not let down our guard because greedy, ignorant Christians resent the progress made by clever, reasonable secularists, and they will do everything they can to manipulate their way into power to prevent decent folk from having a good time and living their lives in freedom. There isn't a single fact in this story, yet many consider it to be accurate history. The most popular college history text in print today, A People's History of the United States, is a 768-page diatribe, bereft of a single footnote offering precisely this point of view. If people believe this story, they'll not only view secularism as the key to human flourishing, they'll insist on locking Christians out of positions of influence. Is it working? To find out, let's dive into an examination of what the worldview of secularism is all about, assess its level of influence, and delve into the particular ways it seeks to answer life's ultimate questions. Section 3, the secularist narrative. Based on exhaustive review of secularist writings, it is important to secularists to present themselves as unbiased and neutral, whereas Christians, and presumably other theists, are biased and extremist. David Neos, as an example, considers secularism to be a post-theological worldview. Secularism is derived from the word saeculum, which is a Latin term for a span of time, typically a generation. As Jose Casanova phrased it, secular then stands for self-sufficient and exclusive secularity, when people are not simply religiously unmusical, but are actually closed to any form of transcendence beyond the purely secular immanent frame. In other words, secularist concern is for the current age, as opposed to eternity, and human beings, as opposed to God. Regardless of their personal theological commitments, secularists seem to believe that all public considerations, education and government primarily, must be based on materialism, the idea that only the physical world exists. Georgetown University professor Jacques Barenblau says, "The secularists are here and now people. They live for this world, not for the next." If materialism is true, any concern about non-material things such as God, spirituality, or an afterlife is at best misguided and at worst dangerously deluded. Barenblau defines secularism narrowly as a political philosophy concerned with the best way to govern complex, religiously pluralistic societies. Is secularism truly just a narrow political stance, something that affects how people view religion and politics, or is it something more? We think there is enough evidence to prove that secularism is a worldview, a coherent pattern of ideas, beliefs, convictions, and habits. Understanding secularism as a worldview helps us see where it conflicts with Christianity, so we are not taken captive by its false teachings, and so we can articulately respond to areas in which secularist teachings threaten human flourishing. Proponents of secularism have engaged in a century-long project to develop scientific, historical, and even theological credibility in order to ensure secularism's place as a dominant narrative of culture. Whether they have succeeded with this project is a point of contention, but understanding the ways secularism asserts itself as a worldview will help unlock how practically every university class is taught today. It It also helps demystify much of what happens in politics, government, and the media. Secularism's opposition to Christianity does not mean the two worldviews have nothing in common. Secularists share a concern with thinking Christians about the direction America is headed. Self-described atheist and humanist Susan Jacoby says, during the past 4 decades, America's endemic anti-intellectual tendencies have been grievously exacerbated by a new species of semi-conscious anti-rationalism feeding on and fed by an ignorant popular culture of video images and unremitting noise that leaves no room for contemplation or logic. Thoughtful Christians would agree. In fact, in 2008, Prometheus Books, a publishing company founded by atheist philosophy professor Paul Kurtz, for the express purpose of promoting secularism, published Distracted, a book voicing deep concern with the direction of popular culture. The author, Maggie Jackson, asks, are we heading into a dark age? To ask this question is first to wonder whether we at present have much of a collective appetite for wrestling meaningfully with uncertainties, and whether we have the will to carve out havens of deep thinking amid the tempests of time. Thoughtful Christians wonder this same thing too. While secularists and Christians are both concerned about America's direction, when it comes to understanding why we're off course and what should be done about it, their answers could not be more different. To unlock the differences, we'll look at the history of secularism, examine whether it is truly a coherent worldview, and expose its aims and methods. Section 4. The history of secularism in America. Modern-day American secularists are intellectual descendants of Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, deists who endorsed the basic morality of the Christian God but did not believe in his miraculous direct involvement in the world. Doctrines considered divisive, such as the Trinity, were done away with. These American founders, secularists claim, were searching for a civic religion, not a saving faith, which they say is why specific references to God were omitted from the Constitution. The seeds of deism planted in the 18th and 19th centuries came to full bloom in the 20th century, first in America's universities and then in popular culture. Quoting noted sociologist Christian Smith, Hunter Baker observes that Smith sees today's secularism as a very purposeful movement with clear aims. And he says, the secularization of the public order was the result of an intentional program by secular activists. These activists were largely skeptical, free-thinking, agnostic, atheist, or theologically liberal, well-educated persons, located mainly in knowledge production occupations, who generally espoused materialism, naturalism, positivism, and privatization or extinction of religion. This group successfully changed the dominant understandings of science, higher education, primary and secondary education, public philosophy, church-state doctrine, the model of personhood, from the soul to a psychologized self, and journalism. Sorry about that. If, as Smith claims, the growth of secularism was intentional, we'd expect it to propose answers to life's ultimate questions. It does indeed. Among those advancing secularism, none were so bold and clear about their views and aims as a uniquely 20th century group of professors and theologians who called themselves secular humanists. Section 5. The Rise of Secularism. In the 1930s, a group of atheist and agnostic professors, including University of Michigan professor Roy Wood Sellers and John Dewey, widely considered to be the father of American public education, wrote and signed a document called the Humanist Manifesto. The manifesto's goal was to develop a new religious movement based on science, an inspirational faith to replace the dogmatic old attitudes promoted by theistic religions. The authors wrote, "Today, man's larger understanding of the universe, his scientific achievements, and deeper appreciation of brotherhood have created a situation which requires a new statement of the means and purposes of religion. Such a vital, fearless, and frank religion capable of furnishing adequate social goals and personal satisfactions must be shaped for the needs of this age. The original manifesto was updated 40 years later in 1973 and signed by hundreds of prominent scholars, including Francis Crick, early pioneer in DNA research, famed psychologist B.F. Skinner, and dozens of secular ministers. A third version, subtitled A Call for a New Planetary Humanism, was released in the year 2000. The central theme of all three manifestos is the elaboration of a philosophy and value system that excludes belief in God and traditional religion. The signers of the various humanist manifestos agreed to focus their work on the needs of this age, which is secularism, and on advancing humanity, rather than concern with God. They describe themselves, therefore, as secular humanists. Today, secular humanism is probably the most concise expression of what secularists believe, whether or not they embrace the title. As you can imagine, the humanist manifestos received a lot of attention for their ebullient claims regarding both the secular nature of reality and the capacity of science to solve humanity's problems. Alarmed by the bold anti-Christian stance of the Humanist Manifesto, Christian pastors and professors saw secular humanism as a secret force designed to carry secularist ideas deep into the institutions of power, particularly the courts and universities. Today, secularists are quick to deflect such criticism by downplaying the authority of these controversial statements. The manifestos, they claim, are not permanent or authoritative dogmas, but subject to ongoing critique. 21st century secularists, like the light secular humanism, has provided... I didn't get that sentence right. Let's try that again. The manifestos, they claim, are not permanent or authoritative dogmas, but subject to ongoing critique. 21st century secularists, like the light secular humanism has provided, but they fear being burned by its heat. Okay, there we go. Some secularists go further and deny having any influence at all. Jacques Burenblau, for example, writes this: where exactly was the empire of American secularism? Where was its army, its impassioned hordes, its war chest? There was none of that, though there were elite units, so to speak. Secularism's defenders were stationed in print and television newsrooms. They worked in cinema and the domains of high art. Down on campus, you had entire platoons of bespectacled secularists who sympathized with the cause, but those elites were either too unfocused or too poorly led, or too weakly aligned with the movement, or too few to repel the onslaught of the revivalists. It is more than a little ironic to find a leading secularist expressing defenselessness because his empire only controls print and television news, the popular culture, and entire platoons of college professors. As we will see, by the time Burenblau began downplaying secularism's influence, its triumph was complete, with its ideas deeply embedded in nearly every channel of influence. Section 6, where secularism is influential today. In 1976, a professor from California named Peter Angeles, edited a boisterous volume entitled Critiques of God, in which he predicted that supernatural religions would soon disappear from the earth. Science, according to Angeles, displaced God from heaven because no such place exists, and it has displaced him from earth because a creator was no longer necessary. Angeles insisted, it is not that God is being relegated to a remote region. It is not that God has become a bodiless abstraction. It is the realization that there is no God left to which to relate. Without God, what is left? Man and the universe. That should be enough. That has to be enough, because that is all there is. Things didn't turn out as Angeles expected. Susan Jacoby concedes, as we now know, the conclusion that American fundamentalists were a dying breed was a misjudgment of historical proportions. Today, though, secularists can find hope in the Pew Research Center's new research. Among those 18 to 29 years of age, 1/3 claim no religious affiliation. While some of these young people merely have commitment issues, many are probably secularists. David Neos, president of the American Humanist Association, notes that 12 to 18% of Americans are secularists. This 12 to 18% includes only those who claim the secularism title. The larger issue may be those claiming the Christian mantle but living as if secularism were true. Author Craig M. Gay names the problem practical atheism. Under modern conditions, he says, the question of God is simply irrelevant to so much of what we do on a daily basis that it eventually drops out of mind and heart. God is simply forgotten. One common approach among Christian thought leaders to the rise of secularism is to grant secularism's assumptions, but sentimentally labor to make the Christian peg fit into the secularist hole. Christians are people too, they plead. According to Gay, these efforts, while well-intended, only serve in replacing biblical truth with a counterfeit gospel. It seems that once truly Christian faith and hope are lost, they have quite often, under modern conditions, only been transmuted into faith and hope in a humanly constructed future. Secularists can be viewed in their natural habitat at nearly any of America's more than 3,000 colleges and universities. Here, secularists have found success capturing impressionable young adults as they are released into the wild. Many secularists see themselves as liberators, lifting students out of religious superstition and other nonsense holding back society's progress. According to a report by the National Bureau of Economic Research, whose president is a professor at MIT, secularists embrace a science drives out superstition hypothesis, which says if religion reflects primarily ignorance, irrational fears, and superstition, then increased education could reduce religiosity by reducing ignorance and inculcating science. Interestingly, given secularist preoccupation with science, researchers who have examined the presence of religion on college campuses have found that the greatest influence of secularism is in the humanities and social sciences, not in the biological or physical sciences. According to the NBER study, being a physical or biological sciences major had a negligible impact on students' faith, but being a humanities or social science major has a statistically significant negative effect on religious attendance and self-assessed importance of religion in one's life. Social science seems to have slightly stronger effects. All of the negative effects of both of these majors appear to become more negative over time, with the effect of being a social science major on religious importance almost doubling. Given that religious students are attracted to humanity majors in high numbers, the damaging effect of the humanities and social sciences should be of special note for those concerned about Christian students losing their faith on campus. How many professors claim a secularist worldview? Of the 1,417 professors queried in a 2006 study called Politics of the American Professoriate, let's go with professoriate, Politics of the American Professoriate Survey, 22.9% said they either didn't believe in God, so they're atheist, or didn't know whether there is a God, meaning agnostic. By contrast, 34.9% said they knew God exists and had no doubts about it. Interestingly, the levels of belief in God among professors were highest in accounting and elementary education, but lowest in psychology and mechanical engineering. If these study results hold true, your chances of having an atheist or agnostic professor in the humanities, social sciences, computer science, and engineering are about 1 in 3. In the physical and biological sciences, your chances of having an atheist or agnostic professor are 1 in 2. But as we saw earlier, students in these majors aren't as negatively affected in their faith. The only places in the university not controlled by secularists, according to this survey, are in the health or agricultural departments. Still, some people say, that's not too bad. The percentages of atheists and agnostics on campus are higher than in the general population, but they're not the majority. True, on the surface, but let's scratch deeper. Your chances of running into a professor who believes in God are 2 in 3. But only half of those express any kind of Christian belief. And among professors who claim to be Protestant or Catholic, the chances that the person will be religiously conservative, that he or she will actually believe the Bible is true, for example, are about 1 in 20. For example, if the national statistics hold true at, say, Princeton University, we would expect to find only 21 professors who are Christian and oriented toward traditional values. For example, against abortion and in favor of marriage being defined as between one woman and one man, out of more than 1,100 full-time and visiting professors. So that's 21 out of 1,100. On the other hand, we would expect on average 262 professors who are secularists. In the end, you're 10 times more likely to run into a secularist professor than a Christian professor who is oriented toward traditional values. Some critics have taken issue with the pervasiveness of secularism on campus, pointing to a finding from the Spirituality in Higher Education project at UCLA that 81% of professors consider themselves spiritual. But the definition of spiritual employed in the survey was whether a person is actively searching for meaning and purpose in life, is becoming a more self-aware and enlightened person, and is finding answers to life's mysteries and the big questions. This is so broad a definition, we're astounded the researchers found 19% of professors who disagreed with it. The UCLA view of spirituality as a vague search for meaning and purpose stands in opposition to any meaningful definition of religion. To be spiritual means that a person is interested in different religious traditions, seeks to understand other countries and cultures, feels a strong connection to all humanity, believes in the goodness of all people, accepts others as they are, and believes that all life is interconnected and that love is at the root of all the great religions. Religions, on the other hand, make claims to exclusivity. They can't all be equally correct in their assessment of what is real, what is wrong with us, and what ought to be done about it. Thoughtful adherents of Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, or any one of dozens of other major religions would, in all likelihood, find themselves disagreeing with UCLA's definition of spirituality. So a student heading off to college is practically guaranteed to encounter secularism and will find it a very rare species of professor who will share the student's desire to maintain a faith in God, in Jesus, in the truth of the Bible, and in the application of these beliefs to the culture. Still, just because secularism is pervasive does not mean it is coherent. So we must ask, is it actually fair to claim that secularism is a discernible pattern of ideas, beliefs, convictions, and habits? Section 7. Is secularism actually a worldview? Recall the definition of a worldview: a pattern of ideas, beliefs, convictions, and habits that help us make sense of God, the world, and our relationship to God and the world. When they see this definition, some secularists dismiss it. I don't believe in God. Therefore, I do not have a religious worldview by your definition. Let's take this criticism in two parts. First, does secularism offer a comprehensive view of reality? Charles Taylor, the widely acknowledged leading expert on secularism, thinks so. Taylor finds inadequate the common notion that secularism is merely a means of secularizing public spaces. Neither is secularism only a description of the general decline of belief and practice. Rather, he says secularism consists of new conditions of belief. It consists in a new shape to the experience which prompts to and is defined by belief, in a new context in which all search and questioning about the moral and spiritual must proceed. In other words, secularism is more than disbelief in God. It is belief in ways of seeing life and the world that do not It is a belief in ways of seeing life and the world that do not involve God or religion. Hunter Baker agrees. Secularization theory may have begun as a political theory, he says, but as it expanded in the 20th century, it came to affect the totality of cultural life and ideation in a variety of areas such as the arts, philosophy, and literature. It is hardly possible for it to be otherwise. When one rejects the idea of divine creation, the range of possible theories about human purpose narrows considerably. A secularist must almost by definition be a materialist, meaning they believe that only the material world exists. And if a materialist, then a determinist, since by believing that human behavior is determined by evolutionary heritage, no free will exists. We see then that secularism passes the first test of being a pattern of ideas, beliefs, convictions, and habits. Now let's look at the second part of the criticism. Secularism's denial of being religious. We don't believe in God, secularists claim, therefore we are not religious. After all, what is secular if not the rejection of religion? Not so fast. Secular certainly implies the rejection of supernatural religion, but not all religion is supernatural. If we accept the dictionary definition of religion as any set of beliefs about the cause, nature, and purpose of the universe, then the very fact that secularism is consistent and in that consistency attempts to answer life's ultimate questions does make it religious. The late anthropologist Clifford Geertz, for many years a professor at Princeton University, referred to both secularism and religion as cultural systems. Mark Juergensmeyer, perhaps the world's foremost expert on global religion and religious violence, claims that secular nationalism is a strange religion that spreads with missionary zeal and is, like religion, an ideology of order. Emile Durkheim, the founder of the field of sociology and perhaps the principal architect of what we now call the social sciences, considered religions to be, as paraphrased in a recent report, functional organizations that use striking ideas to foster collective action and the interests of the religious community as a community, including influence over both daily interactions among members and relationships with those outside. For Durkheim, a worldview need not be supernatural to count as religious. It just needs to focus on the sacred, the collective ideals that have fixed themselves on material objects. They are only collective forces hypostasized, that is to say, moral forces. They are made up of the ideas and sentiments awakened in us by the spectacle of society, and not of sensations coming from the physical world. Secularism is clearly a cultural system using striking ideas to foster collective action and influence its members to focus on collective ideals with missionary zeal. By this criterion, secularism is a religion, just one that denies the relevance of the supernatural. If secularism is indeed a religious worldview, we can compare its views on general and special revelation to other worldviews to see if they sufficiently answer life's ultimate questions. Let's start with the idea of general revelation, that there is something revealed to all people that explains the universe as we know it. Section 8, how we got here. A secularist view of general revelation. One reason secularists are offended at being called religious is their embrace of the narrative that religion and science are opposed to each other. Religion is based on superstition and ignorance, they say, whereas science is the systematic, impartial application of reason and intelligence. Science has rescued the modern world from the religiously backward. It's not like that. According to Hunter Baker, what happened in the matter of science and religion was the creation of a legend. Part of this legend is that evolution explains the existence of all things. This, for Carl Sagan, is a fact, not a theory. Even though Charles Darwin felt the need to postulate a supernatural force to explain the initial appearance of life, The secularists cannot afford such a concession. Harvard paleontologist Richard Lewontin admitted this bias when he said, "Materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door." The famed E.O. Wilson concurred, "A scientific humanist is someone who suggests that everything in the universe has a material basis, and that means everything, including the mind and all its spiritual products." To secularists, science isn't just one way of knowing, it is the only reliable way of knowing. A true definition of science, to their way of thinking, excludes supernatural explanations for any event, including the origin of life. For secularists, naturalism explains everything. Julian Huxley summed it up: modern science must rule out special creation or divine guidance. Why must science rule out creation? As we have noted, science cannot observe or measure the supernatural and therefore cannot know anything about it. Of course, by this definition, science cannot render judgment on the theory of evolution either. One-time only historical events, such as the origin of life, fall outside the parameters of the scientific method. They cannot be repeated, observed, tested, or falsified. Accordingly, neither creationism nor an evolutionary account of origins is strictly scientific. Secularism relies on evolution for much more than a theory about the origin of life. The theory of evolution has significant implications for ethics, sociology, law, and politics. Secularists believe that evolutionary theory provides the grounds for proper understanding of the world. For this reason, secularists encourage teaching evolution as fact throughout our educational system, thereby relegating the supernatural, especially God, to the world of literary mythology. And this is in every class, not just biology. In the words of Julian Huxley, it is essential for evolution to become the central core of any educational system because it is evolution in the broad sense that links inorganic nature with life, and the stars with earth, and matter with the mind, and animals with man. Human history is a continuation of biological evolution in a different form. Since Huxley's time, however, many in the scientific community have challenged the idea that Darwin's theory of evolution can explain the existence of all things. To the secularist mind, though, this is a distressing turn of events. Secularists are fond of labeling Christians as dogmatic, but they neglect to mention that believing life to have arisen from non-life is as sacred a doctrine to secularists as the doctrine of the incarnation is to Christians. Secularist Keith Parsons, for example, asserts, with the environment operating to remove non-viable variations, the appearance of life on Earth becomes a certainty rather than an extreme improbability. This is a statement of faith, and since it is not based on evidence, even a blind faith. Darwin's embarrassment over his theory's conflict with the fossil record is evidenced by the fact that, in The Descent of Man, Darwin did not cite a single reference to fossils in support of his belief in human evolution. Despite Darwin's own reservations, however, atheists wrested the theory from his hands and proclaimed evolution to be fact. Julian Huxley declared that Darwin rendered evolution inescapable as a fact, and all-embracing as a concept. Perhaps in 1960, Huxley could get away with such a rash claim, but today, as we demonstrate in this text, faith in evolution as the grand explanation of all things has become a counter-rational religious dogma. Evolution is a religion, says the evolutionist Michael Ruse. This was true of evolution in the beginning, and it is true of evolution still today. Ruse further says, evolution therefore came into being as a kind of secular ideology, an explicit substitute for Christianity. It stressed laws against miracles, and by analogy, it promoted progress against providence. So where are we? General revelation from the secular standpoint bets the farm on science as the only means of knowing. It's a more risky bet than secularists admit. In the introduction to the 1971 edition of Darwin's The Origin of Species, L.H. Matthews admitted, The fact of evolution is the backbone of biology, and biology is thus in the peculiar position of being a science founded on an unproved theory. It is then a science or a faith. Belief in the theory of evolution is thus exactly parallel to belief in special creation. Both are concepts which believers know to be true, but neither, up to the present, has been capable of proof. The sort of faith Matthews described is dissatisfying when it comes to the questions humanity is really asking. The philosopher C.E.M. Joad, whom we met in the chapter on Christianity, offered a devastating critique. A religion which is in constant process of revision to square with science's ever-changing picture of the world might well be easier to believe, but it is hard to believe it would be worth believing. It seems, though, that secularists believe it nonetheless. What this belief looks like in its particulars is the topic to which we will next turn. Section 9, Special Revelation, where secularists turn for direction. Like Christianity and Islam, secularism proposes answers to life's ultimate questions, and its claims I'm doing really bad reading today. Let's try that again. Like Christianity and Islam, secularism proposes answers to life's ultimate questions, and it claims sources of knowledge that reliably support the legitimacy of these answers. As in the chapters on other worldviews, let's see if we can understand secularism better by posing 5 questions. On what sources of revelation do secularists draw? What does secularism say about humanity? What does secularism say is wrong with us? What does secularism say about how we should live? And how are we to understand other worldviews based on secularism? Question 1. If you ask enough secularists which books have influenced them most, you'll often hear the following: Thomas Paine, The Age of Reason; The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin; On the Genealogy of Morals, Friedrich Nietzsche; Civilization and Its Discontents, Sigmund Freud; Democracy and Education, John Dewey; Why I Am Not a Christian, Bertrand Russell; The Second Sex, Simone de Beauvoir; Toward a Psychology of Being, Abraham Maslow. Within the last few years, a canon of new atheism has developed in the popular culture, at least, with the writings of Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, and the late Christopher Hitchens, who are referred to in a wry apocalyptic reference as the 4 horsemen of atheism, because they seem to take glee in attacking religion with every thought weapon they can find. In Dawkins's lectures, for instance, he often wins standing ovations among secular students and professors with an artful ad hominem. The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction, jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully. That's got a lot of words in there. None of them are really good, so let's just go with that. I do need to learn how to pronounce them, though. The various humanist manifestos also serve as a source of secularist revelation. As the author of the 1973 manifesto, philosophy professor Paul Kurtz tried pitching a tent big enough to hold more than just atheists. Secular humanists may be agnostics, atheists, rationalists, or skeptics, but they find insufficient evidence for the claim that some divine purpose exists for the universe. He wrote, "They reject the idea that God has intervened miraculously in history, or revealed himself to a chosen few, or that he can save or redeem sinners." If a clear statement of secular belief has been written, we haven't found it, except for this oft-quoted line from the 1973 manifesto: "If no deity will save us, we must save ourselves." Hundreds of people indicating agreement affixed their signatures to the document. The subsequent Humanist Manifesto 2000 included hundreds more signatures. As mentioned earlier, Kurtz also began a publishing company called Prometheus Books, now located in Amherst, New York. Prometheus' catalog serves as a pretty clear canon of secularist belief, though some of it is disturbing, including a book attempting to normalize adult child sex. And on the chance that the hand that rocks the cradle truly rules the world, Prometheus even publishes children's books, including one by Chris Brockman called What About Gods?, which read in part, "Many people say they believe in a God. Do you know what a God is? Do you know what it means to believe in a God? A God is a mythical character. Mythical characters are imaginary. They're not real. People make them up. Dragons and fairies are two of many mythical characters people have made up. They're not real. Goodbye, Santa. Goodbye, Tooth Fairy. Goodbye, Jesus." In spite of the substantial agreement among secularists about embracing science and rejecting Christianity, many have questioned whether secularism is truly a coherent enough worldview to attract the masses. That a lot of people have signed the Humanist Manifesto may or may not mean anything. Some people are quite promiscuous with their signatures, especially on college campuses. Plus, organizations like the American Humanist Association are relatively small, operating on about the same budget as a church with 20 staff members, of which there are several hundred in the United States. The AHA's founders and chief promoters are all dead. It is also possible that most secularists have never even heard of AHA's manifesto and would never sign it even if they had. But it would be wrong to confuse the issues of whether someone believes something and whether he or she is willing to affix a signature to it. When we talk about worldviews, we're talking about the ideas people hold in their subsequent commitment to certain beliefs, convictions, and resulting habits, not about the organizations to which they pay dues. If we can understand someone's theology, philosophy, and ethics, we can probably make fairly accurate guesses about his or her views in other disciplines as well. Probabilities, not certainties, are sufficient to help us understand the patterns of ideas. Question 2. What does secularism say about humanity? As we've seen, most secularists believe the theory of evolution is the basis for explaining everything we need to know about how we got here and what we should do now. In the secularist worldview, we are evolving animals, continually progressing onward and upward toward some form of biological and social perfection. Julian Huxley believed that all reality is a single process of evolution. Secularists believe we are capable of controlling our own evolutionary development. Huxley wrote, "Today, in 20th century man, the evolutionary process is at last becoming conscious of itself and is beginning to study itself with a view to directing its future course." But what is it that makes someone human? Christians and Muslims believe God made human beings. Christians further believe God made human beings as his own image bearers. But if secularists are correct that evolution explains everything, what is it that makes humans unique? Nothing, really. Most secularists embrace some form of mind-body monism, which says that human beings are made of one substance, merely matter in motion. We have no spirits or souls, and our minds are only projections of brain activity. At first, this sounds absurd. No minds? How can we think if we have no minds? But secularists are not saying we do not think. They view the mind and the brain as essentially the same thing. Corliss Lamont, one-time humanist chaplain at Harvard, explained, "If the monistic theory of psychology is true, as naturalism, materialism, and humanism claim, then there is no possibility that the human consciousness, with its memory and awareness of self-identity intact, can survive the shock and disintegration of death. According to this view, the body and personality live together, they grow together, and they die together. Therefore, consistent secularists go beyond viewing the eternal realm as irrelevant. They deny its existence altogether." Lamont went further, rejecting a belief in immortality is the first step to becoming a secularist. The issue of mortality versus immortality is crucial in the argument of humanism against supernaturalism. For if men realize that their careers are limited to this world, that this earthly existence is all that they will ever have, then they are already more than halfway on the path toward becoming functioning humanists. The second implication of the monistic view of the mind arises from the belief that the mind is physical and that it arose through evolutionary processes. If this is so, the mind still evolving? Some secularists believe a more efficient mind is arising today in the form of computer technology. Victor J. Stenger, author of Not by Design, claimed future computers will not only be superior to people in every task, mental or physical, but will also be immortal. He believed it will become possible to save human thoughts, which constitute consciousness, in computer memory banks, as well as program computers in such a way as to give them the full range of human thought. He said, if the computer is just a machine, so is the human brain. Stenger also foresaw the possibility of computers becoming the next step in the evolutionary chain, the new higher consciousness. He concluded, perhaps as part of this new consciousness, we will become God. This isn't just fringe sentiment from a science fiction blogger writing from his or her parents' basement. Stenger was widely cited as one of the top new atheists of our day. Some have taken to calling this transhumanism and anticipate that technology will develop to the point of overcoming human limitations and making human ethical dilemmas a thing of the past. Nick Bostrom, a member of the Faculty of Philosophy at Oxford University, says we will get to the point where we can rightly be described as post-human. Why is it so important for secularists to believe that thinking is nothing more than bits and bytes of brain activity? C.S. Lewis saw the implication long before the dawn of the computer age. The naturalists have been engaged in thinking about nature. They have not attended to the fact that they were thinking. The moment one attends to this, it is obvious that one's own thinking cannot be merely a natural event, and that therefore something other than nature exists. The supernatural is not remote and abstruse. It is a matter of daily and hourly experience, as intimate as breathing. Question 3. What does secularism say is wrong with us? The problem with humanity, according to secularists, is that we are not sufficiently disenchanted with spiritual things. Charles Taylor notes, unbelief for great numbers of contemporary unbelievers is understood as an achievement of rationality. It cannot have this without a continuing historical awareness. It is a condition which can't only be described in the present tense, but which also needs the perfect tense, a condition of having overcome the irrationality of belief. It is this perfect tensed consciousness which underlies unbelievers' use of disenchantment today. But why secularists believe we aren't sufficiently disenchanted, that takes some explaining. Remember, secularists are by definition committed to some version of evolution as the explanation for all that is. The belief that all life evolved from non-life, that it has been evolving upward and onward for 3.6 billion years, colors secularist attitudes toward all reality, especially history. It's a simple case of a new story giving rise to new meaning. That is, if, as secularists believe, all reality is an evolutionary pattern that moves upwards step by step to create rational thought and morality in the most advanced species, then our history also must be a progressive march toward a better world. As the evolutionary process continues, so must progress continue. History is the story of development from non-life to life, simple to complex, unintelligent to intelligent, animal to human, amoral to moral. With each successive generation, we become more fit for survival. Julian Huxley said, man's destiny is to be the sole agent for the future evolution of this planet. This is not to say that secularists are buoyant in their hopes for humanity. Some, like the late science fiction writer Isaac Asimov, saw the problem clearly. In the first place, the phrase survival of the fittest is not an illuminating one. It implies that those who survive are the fittest. But what is meant by fittest? Why are those fittest who survive? This is an argument in a circle. Perhaps the squeamishness comes from the thought that the survival of the fittest principle might function among humans the way it functions in nature, red in tooth and claw. As Alfred Lord Tennyson suggested, with no concern for the weak or poor. Even secularists find themselves repulsed by the way the survival of the fittest doctrine was the explicit justification Marxists gave for their genocide and Hitler gave for his Aryan policies. Still, when they must choose between the survival of the fittest and the idea that humanity fell from an innocent state, they choose the first one. To John Dietrich, it wasn't about rising and falling, it was only about rising. There never has been any Garden of Eden or perfect condition in the past. There never has been any fall, and there has been a constant rise. Man has been climbing slowly up the ages from the most primitive condition to the present civilization. Julian Huxley was even more explicit, insisting that the rise and fall of empires and cultures is a natural phenomenon just as much as the succession of dominant groups in biological evolution. What keeps humanity from progressing to its full potential is that people not sufficiently enlightened about the inevitability of human progress along secularist lines of reasoning. Such people, they say, take us backward when we should be moving forward. The American Humanist Association's president, David Neo, says in Non-Believer Nation, which is a book Richard Dawkins calls excellent, he says, "It's no secret that a major cause of this regression is the religious right, the loose-knit but powerful movement that has been changing the dynamics of American politics for over 3 decades. Guised as representing traditional family values, the religious right is driven by a small minority that is extreme in its views, well-funded, organized, and fueled by a fear of modernity that unfortunately resonates on a mass level." Reading Non-Believer Nation leaves one with the clear impression that religious people, especially evangelical Christians, are bad and secularists are good. It's a new version of the old story. Everything negative in America is the fault of religion, particularly Christianity. Secularism, say its advocates, has led to lower crime, better education, and greater prosperity. These arguments have often been refuted, but they persist nonetheless. Why do so many Americans not see secularism's supposed superiority? To Neos, it is a kind of conspiracy. When the media and others refer to a militant atheist, the object of that slander is usually a non-believer who had the nerve to openly question religious authority or vocally express his or her views about religion. This reflects a double standard that non-believers endure. Religious individuals and groups frequently declare, sometimes subtly and sometimes not, that you are a sinner and that you will suffer in hell for eternity if you do not adopt their beliefs, but they will almost never be labeled militant by the media or the public. Instead, such individuals are typically called devout or perhaps evangelical. No doubt this double standard stems from the predominant notion that tells us that Americans are a religious people. The lesson is clear. If you're not a fervent believer, shut up about it. Neos is right about one thing. There is a bias in the media, but it is probably in the opposite direction of what he suspects. The media's suspicion of Christianity, especially of conservative Christianity, is legendary. Question 4. What does secularism say about how we should live? By denying the existence of God, secularists also deny the existence of an absolute moral code that must be obeyed. They view God's commands, traditionally understood to be the absolute moral order, as harmful fiction. According to Paul Kurtz, the traditional supernaturalistic moral commandments are especially repressive of our human needs. They are immoral insofar as they foster illusions about human destiny and suppress vital inclinations, in other words, in the sexual arena. What must we do, according to secularists, is acknowledge that morality is biological, not theological. V.M. Tarkhan, the father of India's civil rights movement, explained, "Moral behavior of a rudimentary type is found in the higher animals and can be traced even to lower forms of life. This fact is enough to establish that the source of morality is biological and not theological. As we evolve biologically, we need to adjust our ethical principles to evolve as well. It is eminently doable, according to Fred Edwards, president of the United Coalition of Reason. It should be obvious from the most casual observation that human beings are quite capable of setting up systems and then operating within them." To Edwards, What is ethical and moral is obvious to all thinking people, except those, presumably, whose religious commitments cloud their judgment. Julian Wadley calls this natural law and said, "It is not a set of precise rules, but a guide that must be followed using plain common sense." Christians respond to secularist ethical claims by saying that we would not be able to know these ethical laws had God not planted them on our hearts to begin with. Wadley, though, asserted that evolution is just as good an explanation for natural law as a creator. The Declaration of Independence speaks of natural law as an endowment by a creator, whereas I speak of it as the result of humankind's evolution as a social animal. There is a difference, but that difference concerns the questions of how and why we have natural law, not whether or not natural law exists. Regardless of its origin, it is the same natural law. Question 5. How are we to understand other worldviews based on secularism? As is now clear, secularism makes claims about the nature of reality and the duties of humanity that are at odds with the claims of other worldviews. Let's take a look at the secularist response to each of the other worldviews we're considering. To secularists, any reference to the supernatural is ignorant, superstitious, or both. Secularists have developed a substantial body of research attempting to demystify supernatural experiences. These include books debunking paranormal experiences to books dismissing claims of after-death experiences. The idea that there are supernatural principles at work in the world is absurd to secularists, and they will stand in opposition to those who claim otherwise, whether Billy Graham, the Dalai Lama, Eckhart Tolle, Deepak Chopra, or Oprah Winfrey. Secularism and Marxism are the pilot and co-pilot of the airship of materialism. They share the basic belief that the physical or material world is all that exists. Thus, they share nearly identical assumptions about the nature of nature and the nature of humanity, as well as identical critiques of supernatural religion. Where they diverge is on the principle of freedom. Secularists tend to believe that a secular state will lead to the greatest freedom for the greatest number of people. Marxists believe the principle of freedom is a tool used by those in power to keep the workers from rising up and seizing control of wealth. Secularists wish religion would go away, and they would use their own influence to restrict its expression. But they recoil at the crude way Marxists have tried to destroy it. That said, we will see in the ethics chapter that secularist ethical arguments are insufficiently robust to rein in Marxist atrocities. After all, if the fittest survive, who's to say that the Marxists are not merely doing what comes naturally? Secularism may consider Marxist cruelty to be bad manners, but they lack the ethical foundation on which to correct it. Christianity and Islam insist that there is a creator God. For secularists, that fact alone is enough to destroy them as credible worldviews. To quote Isaac Asimov, "To those who are trained in science, creationism seems like a bad dream, a sudden reliving of a nightmare, a renewed march of an army of the night risen to challenge free thought and enlightenment." Still, secularists realize that some Christians and Muslims are more secular than religious, and they want these people in their camp. As long as they're willing to give up being guided by the supernatural in their public actions, they can be in the club. Otherwise, they're dangerous. Georgetown professor Jacques Berenblau says, "Secularism's this worldly tincture has a policy implication. Secularism cannot tolerate religious groups that are otherworldly in radical ways. The most dangerous proponents of faith are those who abhor the saeculum, who view it as incorrigibly corrupt, sinful, and carnal. Their hatred of the present world leads them to hasten their and our promotion to the next. A leading and troubling indicator of an anti-secular worldview is an exaggerated concern with one's fate after death." Berenblau makes it clear that he believes a person with otherworldly beliefs is no different psychologically from a suicide bomber. Postmodernism questions secularism's legitimacy where it hurts the most, that is, whether science and reason can reveal truth. Secularism maintains faith in science and reason while rejecting supernatural faiths. Postmodernism rejects all narratives that claim to access the truth. Secularists believe this amounts to nihilism. Paul Kurtz wrote, "Science does offer reasonably objective standards for judging its truth claims. Indeed, science has become a universal language, speaking to all men and women, no matter what their cultural backgrounds." So whereas secularists believe science can bring us objective truth, postmodernists see scientific statements as containing cultural and personal agendas that prevent their audience from truly knowing reality. Thus, postmodernism serves, as sociologist David Martin memorably phrased it, the secularization of secularism. Section 10. Where does faith come in? As we have mentioned already, secularists are people of faith. They have a thorough faith in the scientific method, the theory of naturalistic evolution, and materialism. They have faith in what they consider to be reasoned arguments that are self-evident to all who are not deluded by other faiths. Above all, they have faith in their own human capacities. Based on these expressions of faith, secularists over the years have developed coherent views in all 10 disciplines we will consider later, including theology and ethics. Many secularists today, though, have begun to rethink their belief in the inevitable rise of secularism. The world is becoming more religious, not less. For example, noted sociologist Peter Berger has recanted his earlier prediction of secularism's supplanting of religion in American society. In Mind and Cosmos, Thomas Nagel stunned the academic world by rejecting materialist explanations altogether. It is prima facie highly implausible that life as we know it is the result of a sequence of physical accidents together with the mechanism of natural selection. He also calls into question the secularist explanation for mind and thinking. If evolutionary biology is a physical theory, as it is generally taken to be, then it cannot account for the appearance of consciousness and of other phenomena that are not physically reducible. Since Nagel is an atheist and one of the most respected philosophers in the world, his work, published by the prestigious Oxford University Press, is hard to dismiss. Also hard to dismiss is an anthology of essays from leading experts called Rethinking Secularism, which questions the validity of secularism's core assumptions. In the popular sphere, Eben Alexander's account of his after-death experience draws on his training as a neurosurgeon and responds to secularist arguments about the existence of the supernatural. Taken together, the evidence of growing doubt about secularism could irreparably damage its foundations. Christians and others may find secularism's arguments intimidating, but do not have sufficient reason to concede to them. When it comes to a worldview attempting to intimidate Christians into setting aside their convictions, though, secularism is nowhere as intimidating a worldview as Marxism. How this is so is what we will examine carefully in the next chapter. The end. Woohoo!